Imagine the richest man who ever lived on this earth. Not Elon Musk, not Jeff Bezos, not Rockefeller, not Rothschild. Mansa Musa, emperor of Mali, 14th century. His wealth was so staggering that modern economists refuse to translate it into dollars. They say the number loses all meaning. Approximately $400 to $500 billion in today's money, possibly more. When he made his pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324, his procession numbered 60,000 people. 12,000 servants carried golden staffs. 80 camels hauled bags of gold dust. Passing through Cairo, he gave away gold so generously that he flooded the market completely and collapsed the price of the metal for 12 years. The Egyptian economy took longer to recover from his charity than from many a conquest. His kingdom sat atop deposits containing more than half of all the gold on the planet. Now look at Mali today, one of the 5 poorest countries on earth. Average life expectancy, 59 years. Per capita income, around $800 a year. Same land, same resources beneath it, an entirely different reality above it. So what happened between then and now? The answer is not laziness, not culture, not bad luck, not climate, and not fate. It is a system, built deliberately, documented in archives, still running today, and in the next 20 minutes I will show you not just what happened, but exactly how it works, with names, figures, and dates. Before we talk about theft, we need to understand what was actually there to steal, and why this matters to every person on this planet, not just Africans, because the image most people carry, that Africa was a primitive, undeveloped land before the Europeans arrived, is not simply a lie. It is the first and most important layer of the con. Without that lie, the entire system cannot function. Let's look at the numbers. Africa holds approximately 30% of the world's mineral reserves. That includes 90% of the world's platinum, a metal without which automotive catalysts, medical instruments, and electronics cannot be made. 50% of all gold, vast deposits of cobalt, the metal without which the battery in your phone and your electric car simply does not exist, and more oil than most people imagine. The Democratic Republic of Congo alone sits on estimated untapped mineral reserves worth $24 trillion. One country, $24 trillion. For perspective, that is more than the entire annual GDP of Europe. The continent holds 60% of the world's uncultivated arable land, yet it produces only 10% of the world's food. Not because the land is poor, but because the infrastructure to work it was deliberately never built. And the population? 1.4 billion people today, projected to reach 4 billion by 2100. The youngest continent on Earth, median age 19. While Europe and Japan grow old and shrink, Africa is young, numerous, and only gathering strength. So let us be absolutely precise about what we are talking about. Africa is not a poor continent. Africa is the wealthiest continent on Earth, in raw resources, arable land, and demographic potential. And yet, the combined GDP of sub-Saharan Africa is smaller than the GDP of France alone, a country of 68 million people against 800 million. This is not an economic puzzle. It is a result, a planned result, and the history of that result begins roughly 500 years ago. But the turning point that explains today is the end of the 19th century. 1885, Berlin, Germany, February, a cold European city. 14 nations sit around a table. Britain, France, Portugal, Belgium, Germany, Italy, Spain, Austria, Hungary, Russia, the United States. Notice who is not at that table. Not a single African leader, not one representative of the continent being divided. Over 3 months of negotiations, lines were drawn on maps, without accounting for languages, without accounting for ethnic boundaries, without accounting for religions or historical alliances, with a ruler and a compass, the way you divide a cake. Of approximately 10,000 African political entities that existed at the time, states, tribal confederations, kingdoms, after the Berlin Conference, only 50 colonies remained. In 26 years, from 1880 to 1906, Europe went from controlling 10% of Africa to controlling 90%. It was the largest resource seizure in human history. But here is what most school textbooks and documentaries fail to say. The physical colonization ended. The economic colonization never did. When African peoples began gaining independence in the 1950s and 60s, they were handed a poisoned gift: flags, anthems, constitutions, but without real control over their own economies. Take the most thoroughly documented example: France. When France granted independence to its African colonies, it did not simply leave. It required the signing of agreements, not public treaties, secret protocols that were not disclosed for decades. The system became known as Françafrique. Under the terms of these agreements, 14 African states were required, first, to keep their national foreign currency reserves not in their own central banks, but in the French treasury in Paris. They did not physically own their own money. Second, they were required to use the CFA franc, a currency controlled by France, one whose exchange rate Paris set unilaterally. In 1994, France devalued the CFA franc by 50% in a single decision. 14 countries woke up one morning twice as poor, with no consultation whatsoever. Third, France held the right of first refusal on any natural resources discovered in their territory. Not the right to negotiate, the right of first refusal. Fourth, French companies had legal priority in government tenders in these countries over any local businesses. Fifth, these countries were required to train their military and civil service officials at French institutions, producing an elite psychologically oriented toward Paris. And what happened to the leaders who refused these terms or tried to revise them? We don't need to speculate. History gave us the answer again and again. Patrice Lumumba, Congo, the first democratically elected prime minister of the country, nationalized the copper mines, refused Western military assistance, killed in 1961, 72 days after taking power. CIA and Belgian intelligence involvement was officially confirmed by declassified documents in the 2000s. Thomas Sankara, Burkina Faso, called Africa's Che Guevara. In 4 years in power, he reduced the national debt, banned luxury imports for officials, launched a program to plant 10 million trees, raised literacy from 13% to 73%, introduced mandatory childhood vaccinations, and announced withdrawal from the CFA franc zone. Killed in 1987 at a government meeting, his body riddled with 15 bullets. His successor, a Paris appointee, reversed every single reform within weeks. Muammar Gaddafi, whatever you personally think of him, in 2009 he was actively promoting the gold dinar, a unified African currency backed by gold that would allow the continent to trade oil without dollars or euros. Declassified Hillary Clinton correspondence directly mentions fear of this project as one of the motives for military intervention. He was killed in 2011. The pattern requires no interpretation, and this is only the political layer. The economic layer goes even deeper. 1944, Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, the end of World War II. The world needs a new financial order. 44 countries take part in the conference. They create the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank. They establish the US dollar as the world's reserve currency, pegging it to gold. All other currencies are pegged to the dollar. Again, we notice who wrote these rules. In practice, two men, American economist Harry Dexter White and British economist John Maynard Keynes. No African delegates were at the table. The interests of the continent were represented by no one. Fast forward to the 1970s and 80s. African states have just gained formal independence. They need capital to build infrastructure, hospitals, roads, schools. They turn to the World Bank and IMF for loans. The money arrives, but it comes with conditions. Those conditions are called structural adjustment programs, a fine bureaucratic name for very specific requirements. In practice, they meant this: to receive a loan, the country must. First, why not cut government spending? Above all, on education and healthcare, precisely what could have built long-term human capital. Second, privatize state enterprises. National airlines, telecommunications companies, mining concessions were put up for sale and purchased by Western corporations at a fraction of their real value. Because in a debt crisis, you do not negotiate from a position of strength. Third, open markets to foreign imports and abolish subsidies for local producers. Farmers in Ghana and Senegal could not compete with subsidized American and European grain. Local textile factories closed under the pressure of cheap imports. Fourth, maintain high interest rates, making domestic credit inaccessible to local businesses, and guaranteeing that the debt to the IMF grows faster than the economy. The result of this construction was mathematically predictable. From 1970 to 2008, Africa received $540 billion in loans. It paid back $550 billion in interest and principal, and at the end of that same period still owed $295 billion. They paid back more than they received, and still owed more than they borrowed. This is not a financial failure. This is a design, a machine that produces debt faster than any economy can repay it. But we still have not reached the very bottom, because there is a mechanism that dwarfs everything listed above put together. It is called illicit financial flows. Every year, money leaves Africa through tax evasion by multinational corporations. As profits are moved to offshore accounts via transfer mispricing, through the undervaluing of exported resources in customs declarations, through illegal extraction disguised as legitimate concessions, through corruption schemes that are technically impossible without Western banks accepting these funds. J.P. Morgan Chase, HSBC, Deutsche Bank. They don't merely know where the money comes from. They built the instruments for it. The figure documented by the UN Conference on Trade and Development, approximately $88 billion per year, every year, consistently, like a tax flowing in reverse. Compare that to foreign aid Africa receives, approximately $48 billion per year. Aid comes in, $48 billion, goes out, $88 billion. Africa is a net creditor to the world, not a recipient, a donor. Global Financial Integrity calculated that over the decades of the post-colonial era, the total value extracted from Africa through all these mechanisms exceeds $50 trillion. $50 trillion. That is the combined GDP of the United States for 2 years, extracted from one continent, systematically, using legally formalized instruments. And here is what makes this story not merely historical, but sharp and urgent right now. This is not the past. It is happening in real time. The cobalt in your phone was almost certainly mined in the DRC, where miners, including children, earn $2 a day. The mining contracts are held by companies registered in Switzerland and the British Virgin Islands. The cocoa in your chocolate comes primarily from Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana. These two countries produce around 60% of the world's cocoa beans, yet they have virtually no domestic chocolate manufacturing, because European Union import tariffs on finished chocolate stand at 30%, while on raw beans they are 0. The tariff system literally forbids them from adding value inside the country. Africa grows the cocoa. Switzerland makes the chocolate and keeps the profit. Mali mines the gold. The London Exchange sets the price. Nigeria pumps the oil. The Netherlands refines it and sells it back. The same scheme, over and over, across the entire continent, for decades. But here is where the story takes an unexpected turn. Because for the first time in a very long time, the machine is breaking down. Not because the West suddenly found goodwill or felt remorse, but because Africans are tired, and they are beginning to act. 2021, Mali tears up its military agreement with France and expels the French Barkhane contingent, which numbered 5,000 troops. 2022, Burkina Faso does the same. 2023, Niger, a military coup. The French ambassador is given 48 hours to pack. France refuses to recognize the new government. It switches off part of the infrastructure it controls. Niger is one of the world's largest uranium producers. French nuclear power stations run partly on Nigerian uranium. For decades, Niger received for that uranium a price set by Paris, one of the lowest on the market. After the coup, Niger turned to other partners, conducted negotiations with Russia and China. The French ambassador left. The French troops withdrew. 3 countries, 18 months. The end of 70 years of French military presence in the Sahel. In 2024, Zimbabwe, Angola, and several other states began settling oil transactions in currencies other than the dollar, in yuan and in local currencies under bilateral agreements. The African Continental Free Trade Area, AfCFTA, launched in 2021, for the first time in history creates a single market for 1.4 billion people with a combined GDP of $3.4 trillion. If it reaches full capacity, if African countries can trade directly with each other without routing transactions through London, Paris, or New York, the financial architecture of control will begin collapsing from within. China has invested more than $300 billion in African infrastructure over the past 2 decades. Yes, debt traps exist. The port of Hambantota in Sri Lanka became the symbol of that danger. Yes, the terms are not always fair, but there is a fundamental difference. The West spent 60 years issuing loans that required resources to leave the country as raw materials. China, pursuing its own strategic goals, let us be honest about that, is building roads, railways, ports, factories, and universities inside Africa, creating infrastructure that keeps part of the value on the ground. This is changing the negotiating positions. For the first time in 1.5 centuries, several major powers are competing for partnership with Africa, rather than simply dictating terms. The US and Europe have felt this. The US-Africa Summit in 2022. New European initiatives, promises of investment, for now mostly words. But the fact of competition itself is leverage that never existed before. So let us return to where we started. Mansa Musa, the richest man who ever lived. His gold crashed the Egyptian economy through sheer generosity. His kingdom fed, traded, and built, while most of Europe was living in mud. His descendants today live in one of the 5 poorest countries on earth. Average age at death, 59 years. Income, less than $1,000 a year. Same land, same resources beneath their feet, a different world above them. This did not happen because of climate, not culture, not intellectual capacity or historical destiny. It happened because of a system, a complex, multi-layered, meticulously documented system of extraction that over centuries pumped wealth from the poorest people on earth to the wealthiest financial institutions in history. And understanding this system matters, not only in order to sympathize with Africa. It matters because every smartphone that gets cheaper in Berlin or San Francisco gets cheaper, partly because a child in Kolwezi earns $2 a day, mining cobalt for it. It matters because the instability in the Sahel, the flows of refugees across the Mediterranean, the humanitarian crises, these are not natural disasters. They are the exhaust of the machine. It matters because the clean energy revolution, solar panels, electric cars, energy storage systems, requires cobalt, lithium, manganese, and rare earth metals. 80% of the world's reserves of which are in Africa. The next 50 years of global energy politics will be played out on African soil. Tesla, Volkswagen, CATL, Samsung, they all already know this. They are all already signing contracts. The question is who will sit at the negotiating table this time, and who will again be left outside the door. That question has no answer yet, but there are far more possible answers today than there were 20 years ago. And the people who understand this are already acting. The story's not finished. Perhaps it is only beginning. If you made it to this point, you just learned something that most universities in the world do not teach. Subscribe. On this channel, we break down history every week based on the facts, without myths, propaganda, or unnecessary noise.